Welcome back to the show. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most ambitious and controversial economic experiments of the 21st century. A national attempt to redefine money, reshape financial identity, and prove that a developing country could leapfrog the traditional financial system entirely. Of course, we're talking about El Salvador, Bitcoin, and the historic decision made in 2021 to adopt Bitcoin not just as an investment, not just as a reserve asset, but as legal tender. And to understand whether this experiment has worked, failed, or simply evolved into something different than the world expected, we have to go all the way back to the conditions that created it, the political moment, the economic pressures, and the motivations of a president who decided that the old way of doing things wasn't going to cut it anymore. Because El Salvador didn't adopt Bitcoin out of curiosity, they adopted it out of necessity. As we record this, the country has been running this experiment for more than 4 years, and the results are finally clear enough to analyze honestly. So today we're going to go through why El Salvador did it, what actually happened inside the country, how much Bitcoin they really hold, how the numbers stack up, what ordinary Salvadorans think about it, and whether the model can ever work for another country. And as always, if you're enjoying these deep dives, make sure you're following the show on Spotify and drop a 5-star rating. It really helps the podcast grow. Let's get into it. When President Nayib Bukele announced in June 2021 that El Salvador would adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, it was unlike anything any modern government had ever attempted. This wasn't like a central bank experimenting with a CBDC or a finance ministry floating the idea of crypto-friendly banking legislation. This was a full, formal, legally binding act of Congress that put Bitcoin on the exact same footing as the US dollar in everyday transactions. From day one, there were 4 core motivations. The first motivation was remittances, and this is crucial. Around 20% of El Salvador's entire GDP comes from money sent back home by Salvadorans working abroad, mostly in the United States. For years, those remittances ran through Western Union, MoneyGram, and other intermediaries charging fees that sometimes exceeded 10%. So for Bukele, the pitch was simple. Bitcoin could slash those fees, speed up transfers, and keep more money in the pockets of Salvadoran families. The second motivation was financial inclusion. More than 70% of Salvadorans had no bank account in 2021. Bitcoin, via the Chivo wallet, offered a way to give millions of citizens a digital payments tool overnight. The government even gave out a $30 Bitcoin bonus to every citizen who activated the app. And for people who had never used online banking, that was a big incentive. The third motivation was branding. El Salvador wanted to reposition itself globally as an innovation hub, not just another small Central American nation overshadowed by crime statistics and economic struggles. Bitcoin was a lightning rod for global attention, and Bukele knew it. Whether people loved or hated the decision, the entire world talked about El Salvador. Tourism numbers later confirmed this. International visitors increased sharply in 2022 and 2023, with the government crediting Bitcoin adoption as one of the contributing factors. And the fourth motivation was the most ambitious, a national store of value. El Salvador had no sovereign currency. It used the US dollar. That meant they couldn't print money, couldn't devalue the currency, and couldn't run independent monetary policy. By accumulating Bitcoin, Bukele hoped to create a long-term national reserve asset, something that could grow in value over decades and help lift the country out of dependence. So that was the plan. But did it work? To answer that, we need to look at what actually happened on the ground, not the headlines from critics or Bitcoin maximalists, but the real data. On September 7, 2021, the Bitcoin law went into effect, and every merchant in the country became legally required to accept Bitcoin. The Chivo wallet launched with widespread excitement, but also heavy criticism. Bugs, crashes, identity theft issues, and a large portion of the population struggling to understand the interface. In the early days, Bitcoin ATMs were installed across the country. Money was flowing into wallets. And for a moment it looked like a genuine transformation was happening. But when the government stopped offering incentives, usage dropped sharply. Studies from 2022 and 2023 found that while millions downloaded the app, only a small minority used Bitcoin regularly. Most people cashed out their $30 bonus and went straight back to using dollars. Merchants reported something similar. They accepted Bitcoin if they had to, but most customers still preferred cash or card. The volatility didn't help. One day a coffee cost a few thousand satoshis, the next day it might cost more. Salvadorans wanted stability. They wanted predictability. Many saw Bitcoin as an investment, not a currency for buying groceries. So if public adoption fell short of expectations, what about the government's own Bitcoin strategy? Bukele kept buying. Public records and his own tweets show that El Salvador accumulated 2,800 Bitcoin between 2021 and 2024. When Bitcoin crashed to $16,000 after the FTX collapse, critics declared the experiment a failure. The International Monetary Fund warned the country to unwind its Bitcoin exposure. Opposition parties demanded audits. But Bukele didn't sell. He kept accumulating. And when Bitcoin surged again in 2024 and 2025, El Salvador's holdings, depending on the exact purchase dates, went from deep in the red to massively in the green. On some days, the BTC reserves were showing unrealized profits of over $100 million. This doesn't erase the volatility, and it doesn't mean El Salvador is saved financially. But it does mean the store of value argument wasn't as naive as critics suggested. Bukele treated Bitcoin like a long-term investment, not a political stunt. And on that front, purely mathematically, the numbers show the position recovered. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll get into the part everybody argues about. Has Bitcoin actually worked for El Salvador? And what does the real evidence show once you strip away all the hype and headlines?
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows homes, so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download Thumbtack today.
What can 160 years of experience teach you about the future? When it comes to protecting what matters, Pacific Life provides life insurance, retirement income, and employee benefits for people and businesses building a more confident tomorrow. Strategies rooted in strength and backed by experience. Ask a financial professional how Pacific Life can help you today. Pacific Life Insurance Company, Omaha, Nebraska, and in New York. Pacific Life and Annuity, Phoenix, Arizona.
Welcome back. Let's ask the next big question. And that question isn't whether the country made or lost money on paper. The bigger question is, did Bitcoin improve daily life? Did it strengthen the economy? Did the experiment fulfill its promises? And this is where the verdict becomes more nuanced. Remittances? The share of money sent home using Bitcoin remains tiny, around 1% to 2%, far below the government's hopes. Most people still use dollar-based transfer services. Merchant adoption? Also low. Many Chivo POS terminals installed in 2021 and 2022 sit unused today. National financial independence? Still limited. El Salvador still uses the US dollar for salaries, taxes, big purchases, and savings. But that doesn't mean nothing has changed. The biggest measurable impact has been branding, investment interest, and tourism. After the Bitcoin law, international tourism soared. The government reported more than a 40% increase in foreign visitors in the first year alone, a massive boost for a country that relies heavily on tourism revenue. Crypto conferences moved there, tech entrepreneurs moved there, Bitcoin miners visited the country. International media attention intensified. More importantly, the Bitcoin policy came alongside Bukele's crackdown on gang violence. And for many investors and tourists, the combination of improved safety and futuristic branding made El Salvador feel like a country finally trying to move forward. The second impact is infrastructure. El Salvador has built geothermal-powered Bitcoin mining operations using volcanic energy, something that could, over time, turn into a genuine revenue stream. Not huge, not transformative, but meaningful. And the third impact is subtle but real: sovereignty. For the first time in its modern history, El Salvador holds a reserve asset that is not controlled by another nation's central bank. That matters. It may not fix everything and it may never replace the dollar, but it's a step toward financial independence. So, has the experiment worked? The honest answer is this. It depends on what you think success looks like. If success means mass local adoption, seamless daily payments, or Bitcoin replacing the dollar, then no, that hasn't happened. Not even close. If success means branding, global attention, tourism, a growing BTC reserve, and a long-term bet on financial sovereignty, then yes, the experiment has brought real benefits. But in truth, the real outcome sits somewhere in the middle. El Salvador didn't prove that Bitcoin can replace a currency, but it did prove that a nation-state can hold Bitcoin, integrate it into its economic identity, and ride out volatility without collapsing, something many analysts thought was impossible. It's a long-term play, and like any long-term play, the results won't be fully understood for decades. And before we wrap this up, there's one more angle we need to talk about, because it's the part of the story most people overlook. Yet it's arguably the most important piece when you're trying to assess whether this experiment has truly worked. And that's the psychological shift that's taken place inside El Salvador over the past 4 years. When Bitcoin was first introduced as legal tender, a lot of Salvadorans were skeptical. Some were outright resistant, and honestly, that reaction made perfect sense. You can't take a country that has relied on the dollar for 2 decades and expect people to suddenly treat a volatile digital asset as everyday money. Humans don't work like that. National habits don't change overnight. But what has changed, slowly, quietly, and mostly under the radar, is the way Bitcoin has entered the national conversation. If you look at how Salvadorans talked about Bitcoin in 2021 versus how they talk about it now, the tone is completely different. Early on, the sentiment was panic, confusion, frustration with the Chivo rollout, and fear that their savings could evaporate. Today, the attitude is more measured. People still prefer dollars for daily life, but they don't see Bitcoin as something threatening anymore. They see it as something the country owns, something the government is building around, something that might not affect them yet, but could eventually become part of a bigger strategy. That shift culturally is enormous. And finally, there's the long-term picture. This is the part the critics refuse to acknowledge. El Salvador didn't adopt Bitcoin to get a quick win. They didn't do it for a one-year boost or a speculative gamble. They did it because they were sick of relying entirely on the dollar, sick of being at the mercy of US monetary policy, sick of having no tool to store national wealth independently. Whether Bitcoin succeeds or fails as a reserve asset can only be judged in decades, not months. If Bitcoin goes to zero, the experiment fails. If Bitcoin continues its historical trajectory, doubling, halving, correcting, grinding higher over years, then El Salvador will eventually sit on one of the most strategically important national holdings in the developing world. So yes, the country still uses dollars. Yes, local adoption never reached the utopian levels some Bitcoiners imagined. But if the goal was sovereignty, branding, long-term wealth, and positioning the nation for the future rather than the past, then the experiment isn't a failure, and it isn't a success. It's a bet, one that is still very much alive. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Follow the show, drop a 5-star rating, and as always, we will see you at the top.